Most people spend their lives trying to avoid risk. They avoid situations where they could fail, be judged, or lose what they already have. And because of that, they believe they are making safe choices. On the surface, this seems logical. After all, if something feels uncertain, it must be risky. But there's a problem with the way humans think about risk. Whenever we consider changing our lives, our minds immediately begin calculating everything that could go wrong. We imagine failure. We imagine rejection. We imagine wasted effort. We imagine all the possible consequences of taking action. Yet very few people perform the same calculation on the path they're already walking. They rarely ask what could happen if nothing changes. What opportunities might disappear? What experiences might never happen? How many years might quietly pass? Because every path carries consequences. The path of change has consequences, but so does the path of staying exactly where you are. The difference is that one is easy to see. The other often goes unnoticed until years later. And that may be one of the most expensive mistakes that people make throughout their lives. Because while most people spend years worrying about the consequences of changing their lives, very few ever stop to consider the consequences of staying the same. In this video, we'll uncover what it truly costs us when we avoid change, and why even familiar paths come with risks of their own. Welcome to the Glitch Cult, where we expose the hidden truths behind the choices we think are safe, and reveal the risks we almost never see. Most people believe they make decisions by carefully weighing the risks and rewards of every option available to them. But in reality, the human brain is not completely objective when evaluating risk. One of the biggest reasons people struggle to make major changes in their lives is because the brain naturally prefers what is familiar over what is unfamiliar. This sounds simple, but it has enormous consequences. When people hear the word familiar, they often think it means something positive. But familiarity simply means something you have experienced enough times that you understand what to expect from it. A familiar job is not necessarily a good job. A familiar relationship is not necessarily a healthy relationship. A familiar routine is not necessarily a fulfilling routine. It is simply something you know. And because you know it, your brain can predict it. This predictability creates a feeling of safety. For example, imagine someone who dislikes their job. They complain about it every week. They feel stressed, unmotivated, and exhausted. They know exactly what is wrong with it, yet they remain there for years. Why? Because despite all of its problems, the situation is predictable. They know what tomorrow will look like. They know what next month will look like. They know what next year will probably look like. Now compare that to making a change. A new job might be better. It might also be worse. A new opportunity might improve their life. It might also fail. The outcome is uncertain. And uncertainty is what makes the brain uncomfortable. The brain often treats uncertainty as a potential threat because it cannot accurately predict what will happen next. As a result, people frequently choose situations they already know are making them unhappy over situations that might improve their lives, simply because the familiar situation feels easier to understand. This creates a powerful illusion. People begin confusing familiarity with safety, but these two things are not the same. Something can be familiar and still be harmful. Something can be familiar and still be limiting. Something can be familiar and still be preventing growth. Another reason people overestimate the risks of change is because the consequences of action are usually easier to imagine than the consequences of inaction. When people think about making a major decision, their minds immediately begin asking questions. What if it doesn't work? What if I fail? What if I regret it? What if I lose what I already have? These possibilities feel real because they are easy to visualize. But people rarely ask the opposite questions. What if my situation never improves? What if I spend years in the same place? What if I regret never trying? What if staying where I am creates bigger problems later? These risks are harder to see because they happen gradually, and because they are less visible, they are often ignored. This is the first part of the glitch. Humans are remarkably good at calculating the risks of change, but they often fail to calculate the risks of remaining exactly where they are. One of the most common assumptions people make is that choosing not to change something allows them to keep their life exactly as it's been. But that isn't actually what happens. When people avoid making a change, they often imagine that everything remains exactly as it is. The same job, the same relationship, the same lifestyle, and the same version of themselves. But life doesn't work that way. Nothing stays frozen in place. The problem is that most changes happen so slowly that people fail to notice them while they are occurring. Imagine someone who spends 10 years working in a job that no longer challenges them. At first, they recognize the problem. They notice that they're no longer learning. They notice that their enthusiasm is disappearing. They notice that they are becoming less interested in their work. But they stay because leaving feels risky. Now here's the part people rarely think about. Those 10 years don't simply pass. They change the person. A person who stops learning for long enough gradually becomes less curious. A person who avoids challenges for long enough gradually becomes less confident. A person who repeatedly ignores their dissatisfaction gradually becomes more willing to tolerate it. This happens because human beings adapt. The brain is constantly trying to normalize whatever it experiences repeatedly. If something happens often enough, it begins to feel normal. This is useful when adapting to difficult circumstances, but it can also become a problem because the brain doesn't only normalize good situations, it normalizes bad ones too. People can become accustomed to stress. People can become accustomed to disappointment. People can become accustomed to unhealthy relationships. People can become accustomed to lives that no longer excite them. And once something feels normal, people stop questioning it. They stop asking whether things can be better. They stop asking whether their environment is helping them grow. They stop asking whether they are becoming the person they wanted to become. This is why the risks of inaction are so difficult to detect. They don't arrive all at once. There is no dramatic warning sign, no single moment that announces a problem. Instead, the consequences accumulate slowly over years. The danger is not that nothing changes. The danger is that something is always changing. Every year spent in the same circumstances influences what you expect from life, what you believe is possible, what you are willing to tolerate, and ultimately who you become. That is why the greatest risk is not always making the wrong decision. Sometimes the greatest risk is spending so much time avoiding a decision that you never realized the decision was shaping you all along. No matter who you are, whether you're 18, 25, or older, you've already lived through a series of decisions. Some you chose deliberately, others just happened. But what matters is that the years ahead aren't infinite. You don't get a replay button. The truth is, we only get one shot at deciding how we want to live. Whether we've been choosing or postponing, time keeps moving. So the real question is this: what choice will we make now, while we still can, to shape a life we'd be proud to see